Hello, and welcome back to the 2023 CCSE Research Conference, Politics, Communication, and Polarization, hosted by the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and the Brian Lamb School of Communication at Purdue University. I'm Andrea Langrush, Managing Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Before we get started, please be sure you have your camera turned on so our speakers can see you and your microphone on mute. You will use the raise hand function during the Q&A portion of the session. Moderating our first panel today is Bryce Dietrich, Associate Professor of Political Science and Research Scholar for the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement at Purdue University. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois and was recently a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School and Northeastern University. Bryce serves on the advisory committee for the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and is the faculty instructor for the 2024 Video Research Institute. His research uses novel quantitative, automated, and machine learning methods to analyze non-traditional data sources such as audio or speech, data, and video data. These methods are used to understand the causes and consequences of nonverbal cues such as vocal inflections and walking trajectories, especially as they relate to elite political behavior. Bryce's work has been published in several scholarly journals and has appeared in national news media. His grants have received support from major organizations like the NIH and NSF. Join me in welcoming Dr. Bryce Dietrich.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea, for the lovely introduction. So the upcoming panel session that I am moderating delves into two significant aspects of American politics and communication. So we're going to explore the critical role of presidential debates and electoral campaigns and the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news in recent years. We'll highlight in both projects the recent advances in computer vision and affective computing that enable automated coding for the analysis of multimodal communication and televised debates, with a specific emphasis on understanding the motivations behind political elites' dissemination of false information, particularly in the context of the 2021 US Capitol insurrection. And we'll be discussing computational text analysis and assessing the use of modifiers and conducting thematic analysis to identify blame, attribution, and responsibility for resolving the issues, utilizing the data from the US House hearings related to false information. So without further ado, our first presentation is from Joyce Jiang. Joyce is a PhD student at the University of California in Los Angeles, has done a lot of fascinating work with respect to, I would say, generally speaking, machine learning and communications studies, which is kind of how I caught wind of her as an author. And I'm very much looking forward to her presentation. Joyce, take us away.
Hey, thank you so much. So is it better if I share my screen, or because I also shared my slides? Yeah. Okay, sounds
yeah,
good.
you should be able to now.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me to this talk, and I'm so happy to present my work here since I've been using C-SPAN archive library extensively for my multimodal study. I really think it's a
sorry,
great story.
Joyce, not to get too far ahead, but you're in the presenters mode. And so we're seeing your notes and stuff, or at least I am. And so I don't want you to get,
okay.
Right. I don't want your notes to be speak enthusiastically about this slide, and then for us to see that. Okay. So now this is much better.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's good to know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So really happy to present my work since I've been using C-SPAN library extensively for my multimodal study. So right now I'm a PhD student from UCLA Communication Department, and the talk I'll be delivering today is titled Emotions in Televised Debates, Proposing a Multimodal Deep Learning Approach for Emotion Detections. And well, I know that most of our audience have an idea about these key terms, but I still want to provide some brief definitions about what they mean and what do they mean in this context. So generally, when we refer to multimodal studies, we basically means the usage of different modality channels. So you can view visual, auditorial, semantic, transcript, each of them as a different modalities, And people from this kind of multimodal area tend to believe in that integration of more than one modality can lead to better understanding and communication of information processing. And the second term is deep learning, and I guess it has been becoming like a buzzword right now, but it basically refers to a kind of machine learning that utilize artificial neural network and generally have multiple layers. It's really good at it's really good at processing raw features. You can think about them as auditory pixel information, visual pixel information, and convert them into meaningful vector representations for the downstream task. So in our context, it is the emotion detection task. And finally, the area of affective computing basically refers to the intersection of psychology and computer science research, where researchers trying to utilize computational tools to be able to recognize and understand human emotions. So this will be some underlying components of my methodological approach. And of course, we also have some theoretical motivation for us to study televised format of the debate. Okay, so let's say before the televised debate format or area, we can only study issue position and rhetoric strategy based on the textual format. And once we are able to see the political image of these politicians, we actually can have a better understanding of, okay, what are the nonverbal cues they're using and what are emotional debate display. And also like another motivation of my current presentation is just trying to provide a demonstration about how can we utilize the C-SPAN library in a multimodal and computational fashion. And again, so why emotional display matters and what's the additional incentive for doing things in this way on top of just understanding transcript. And so I guess one way we can think about it is candidates can always attach emotions to different kind of political issues to enhance the audience engagement. And once we have different multimodality channels going on, it actually can further heighten the audience response, as previously measured by multiple studies using Twitter volume or tweets engagement, or also just bringing participants to the lab to observe their reaction. So there's some theoretical grounding there. And also when candidates need to regulate their body language and intonation, we can have a better sense about what's their political image and what's the image they want audience to perceive. And of course, there are some existing approach on how people, I'll be covering how people traditionally study emotional display and what we're at right nowadays. So generally, most of the time, communication or political science scholars utilize manual content analysis. So you can think about just bringing research assistant and trying to break your videos into different chunks and having them manually label, okay, what are the emotions, what are the gesture being used here, which is tend to be very reliable, but has an issue of being very time consuming and very labor intensive. And when it comes to the computational era, so basically a lot of research has been focusing on utilizing or extracting low-level signals. So we can think about low-level signals as voice pitch or voice pixels or body movement or even facial expression extracted by facial recognition APIs. And there are several research already arguing that, okay, this kind of low-level nonverbal cues can be used to operationalize a high-level concept, such as different kind of emotions, discrete emotions or valence. And the work has been great, it's really promising, but it does lead to several limitations, I would say. So if we think about the manual approach, it definitely restricting us the terms of the generalizability, like how many candidates can we actually annotate. And so that's one concern. And in terms of the computational approach, although it sort of solved the generalizability issue, but it did question, okay, if we extract facial expressions at each second level, are we ignoring the muscle movement that should be continuously or should be represented in a sequential format? So we call them sequential dependency. And on top of that, even there's an ongoing debates in psychology. Can we really operationalize this low-level signal, such as pitch variation or facial expression, to infer some kind of high-level cognitive appraisal-based emotions? So those are the challenges here. And I would say my approach generally can circumvent these issues. So the pipeline I'll be presenting here, so it's basically a deep learning pipeline involving different stages, and they tend to be very straightforward here. So we generally start with data collection, and particularly in my case, I'll be using the presidential debates in the last 20 years, including 19 candidates. And in the second stage, I'll be introducing what are the different methods I'm using to extract different signals and combining them into the deep learning architecture. The architecture I'll be using include recurrent neural network and BERT model, which I will try to, technically talk about like how can we utilize them in details. So on top of that, I also include two valence, including positive versus negative, because people generally believe in that this valence is more directly related to visual and auditory response as compared to more discrete emotions. But on top of that, I also want to just see how my model can perform in discrete measures. So I do include a bunch of positive and negative emotions with more emphasis on negative emotions because we have been observing like there tend to be more negative emotions being delivered in this kind of political rhetoric. Moving on to more details information here. So the particular video format I'm using, which I collected from the C-SPAN archive, include two forms, which is split screen and switch camera, which I present them there. They tend to be really high resolution, very standardized. So it really provide me a great way for me to extract gesture movement from this form of video. And on top of that, if we talk about the unit of an analysis, so one common way for people to break this video down into different units is just by trimming them based on 5-second or 10-second intervals. I'm trying to find a way that can better incorporate the semantic information. Therefore, what I have done is I use a technique called force alignment, which you can see this like visualization at the bottom. So the idea is you can force the transcript, let's say each sentence in this transcript, to be aligned with the part of the video or the audio in the clip you're getting. So in that way, you can actually trim the video based on different sentence segmentation. So in a sense, I view each sentence conveying its own coherent sentiment message, such as different discrete emotions. And the different classifier I'm building, including two valence and 5 different kinds of discrete emotions, including anger, fear, and anxiety, which are usually used interchangeably in the context, content and disgust, which do rely on different kind of cognitive appraisal, but during our iterative content analysis coding process, we identify these two type of emotions. It's a bit hard to distinguish on the visual level, and that's also like motivated by previous studies, and also sadness and enthusiasm. So the annotation process basically involving iteratively generating very detailed, comprehensive coding scheme that include different cognitive appraisal, motivations, and what are the actions and audiovisual cues research assistants should pay attention to. And we have 2 RAs comprehensively code around 1,000 video clips, which is not super terrible because each clip is only like a couple seconds, but they do need to provide labels in a binary form, so 0 or 1 for 5 to 6 different categories. And here just illustration of the distribution of the video length. The way I select the video, I basically have a hard restriction on I'm only including the sentence clip that's more than 4 seconds, just for the sake of having higher information quality that going into each clip. The reason you're not showing here is it's a kernel smooth, so it's sort of just smooth out the distribution here. And the sentence can also last to like 10-15 seconds, depends on how long this argument is. And in terms of the feature extraction, as I argued before, I have different ways to extract different kind of signals. For the auditorial signals, the method I'm using is using a tool called Librosa. It can basically extract, you can think about it as like a pixel level of information from the auditorial channel. So this one basically include around 20 dimensions that can represent the audio movement or audio change in the speech. And the second, for the visual component, what I have done is using a deep learning tool, which is called OpenPose, that can track different kind of body movement. So as you're seeing like on this illustration, you can track the facial and body landmark in a very granular form, I would say, and then I will feed this information to the visual channel. And in terms of the transcript, because the transcript is not really laid out as how auditory and visual signal is, which is not that sequential, I would say, but more like tokenized. So what I have done is using an NLP tool called BERT to vectorize the sentence into high dimensional space. So I'll be able to integrate all the information in one deep learning architecture. So here's some technical details about like how does each architecture work. So for the auditory and visual signals, which is the MFCC pixel and key points movement, the body movement I illustrated before, they will be fed to a certain kind of neural network called recurrent neural network that can take information at each time step and accumulate information into the sequential time step form. So the way to understand is if you're in the first time 0 or time 1 second, you only get information from that second. But at the end of this spectrum, so let's say 4 seconds, you're basically getting embedding that include all the information before this 4 seconds. So that's how this architecture works. And in terms of the sentence vectorization, I use a model. So BERT has been pre-trained a bunch of corpus, including Wikipedia and a bunch of Google Common Crawl information, and which means this model is intellectual enough just to convert each sentence into a high-dimensional space that can be allocated and to indicate where they locate exactly. So on the right-hand side, there's an illustration demonstrating, okay, once the sentence has been vectorized, where are they located exactly? So using these techniques, we basically can see an overview of the final architecture we're using for our deep learning model. So basically, on the left-hand side, we have the auditory and visual information being fed to different recurrent neural network layers separately. And on the right-hand side, we have the semantic information where we just apply the BERT vectorization to a different sentence in the transcript. And at this stage, they will all be converted to a different kind of vector format, and we just combine these vectors to make it like a giant embedding or vector, and then we'll apply the classifier function to the end of the embedding. So yeah, it's like I would say the overall architecture aligns pretty well with how we, like human, would process information in the multimodal form. And here's some result I want to illustrate here. So there's some key points I want to highlight. So first of all, the data set tend to be, so whenever we're dealing with emotion detection, it tends to be a very imbalanced data set. So what I mean is we tend to have more negative case than positive cases in different kind of emotion annotation. So in a sense, we need to play with some data augmentation or resampling technique to balance between different classification or classifiers. So I basically use a data augmentation technique that just keep resampling the minority class to make it equivalent to the majority class. And after augmentation, we can see this is like the roughly number of data points we're including each classifier. And then on top of that, I basically train the binary classification for each of these emotion categorizations. And the reason why I didn't train them in one multi-classification manner is because there might be some circumstance a person can be both negative and anger or both anger and anxious. So that's very common, which is, yeah, actually what negative emotion is supposed to mean. So I would argue training them in a binary format improves the accuracy and also better capture the richness in this data. And to further unpack this data, so basically, when we're training this kind of models, we should expect the test accuracy or AUC, which is a score that balances the precision and recall measure to be higher than validation. So this is all confirmed in this table. And again, because the data set can be very imbalanced, so accuracy doesn't really tell the whole story. And we should rely on the AUC here, which tells you, okay, it actually balanced the trade-off between precision and recall here. So overall, I'm really happy with the performance here. And I will argue that sentiment analysis tend to be a very fuzzy, very difficult task to do, and especially in the nonverbal cue or emotional display form. So I feel like with the different channel of multimodalities going into this model and with the high quality format of data provided by C-SPAN library, I feel like it definitely leads to the boost of performance in this kind of naturalistic data. And once I have trained them to the level I'm satisfied with, which is as I presented previously, I basically apply the same model to around 4,000 clips I sampled from the last 20 years, because each of them is just a couple seconds. And I still have the same restriction on I only include the videos or the clips that's more than 4 seconds. So here's the general distribution I'm observing here. And again, these distributions are not mutually exclusive because you can have a clip that's both negative and anger or anger and anxiety, just as how we would understand emotion to be. And I do think this kind of distribution align with how we generally expect a distribution of emotions to be in this kind of nonverbal display. So again, just to summarize what I have done in the study. So the goal of the study is to propose advanced deep learning method that can integrate different kind of modality or different kind of signals. So this include visual signals, auditory signals, and semantic signals, which is the textual information. And on top of that, I demonstrate this kind of architecture that can nicely incorporate them into one models and how it can be used to identify different kind of emotion detection tasks. Of course, we can definitely include way more emotion categories than what I've been demonstrating here. And finally, I feel like once we have this kind of approach to identify emotional display, incorporating different modalities, we can expand it to have to more like different elections or different genders, parties, political issues. So I definitely see a lot of promising direction going on for this kind of study. And I think we're definitely at a time to explore this kind of tools advanced by or enabled by the deep learning development. So that's all. And I hope you guys enjoy my slightly technical talk and let me know if you have any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joyce. I believe we do have time for a few questions. We're running a bit behind schedule, so I don't want to disrupt the conference schedule too much. But does anybody have any immediate questions? Sure. Leah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a really cool paper. So I'm going to ask you a question that I grapple with and that I get asked a lot. How can you be sure that the emotions that are being captured computationally are what match the emotions that the people, like how can you be sure that that's what they're expressing?
Yeah, for sure. So usually for this kind of study, we refer them as displayed emotions. So it's necessarily like the general emotion expressed by politicians are more like what's the intended emotion they want to display and want to have the audience perceive. And yeah, similarly, we also have the research system to label this emotion in the way as capturing the display emotion. So the idea is we can only infer this is display emotion, but they're not like expressed. I mean, they are expressed, but they're more like performed emotions. Yeah.
Sure, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused. I thought at the beginning you were almost saying it was a priori negative. And when you had them first screened and you had discussed and things of that sort. But then when you had the 4,000 clips, positive was quite large compared to negative.
Okay, yeah, I think, I did a poor job explaining what do I mean. Okay, so basically, if we dig into the literature of political communication or political science overall, I would say the negative emotion can be broken down into more granular form. So it's easier for to identify like anger, anxiety, disgust, contempt. But in terms of positive emotion, you can probably identify enthusiasm and hope, but you cannot identify them in such granularity. I mean, at least it's not well studied as negative emotion. So
Okay.
that's what
I see
mean.
the granularity. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm gonna selfishly ask a question of my own, and then we'll see if anybody else has something to ask. So the first is I'm gonna do a little self promotion, and I'll put this into chat. So this is a paper that take it for what it's worth. Is that it has been rejected at APSR and AJPS. So take it for what it's worth. But this is my shot at multimodal classification. And so I really enjoyed your discussion of it. So two things that I would do differently in multimodal classification that might be helpful for your project is that one, if you've not encountered wave to vec yet, which is the vectorized representation of audio data, it's a much more efficient way to represent audio signals than using Mel frequency coefficients. And the reason for that is, as you probably found out with Mel frequency coefficients, you have to say, I'm going to use 20 Mel frequency coefficients, which 20 across an audio clip that's, let's say, is 10 minutes long is a little bit different than 20 across an audio clip that's like 30 seconds long. And so there's a lot of, and then so there's a lot of issues with that. The other thing that might be helpful is that the data augmentation step I found is like really helpful in these types of classes. And it seems like you had similar success with that. But like data augmentation with poses is like hard for me to wrap my head around what that would look like. So with audio data, it's easy because data augmentation would be something like adding white noise to the audio files to simulate like different audio qualities. But with video data, I'm kind of curious, like what does data augmentation look like with poses? Because that actually, I can't wrap my head around what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually pretty, okay. So when I say data augmentation, it basically just means upsample the minority class. I didn't do any manipulation, even including the audio, because I did some experimentation and yeah, I talked to some deep learning professor and they're like, oh, you can just upsample it to make them balance. It does mess up like the recurrent precision a bit because you're supposed to have more negative class being presented, but by forcing them to be balanced, you're messing up the data distribution. Like you're assuming they're balanced instead of having more negative class. So it definitely leads to a slightly higher false positive, I would say. So it's more like trade-off. If you upsample in that way, then yeah, you get slightly false positive. Yeah.
Gotcha. Great. And then the last thing I will say, and I don't want to steal my own thunder for the very end of today's session, but please Google Video Research Institute. We would love to have you come to Purdue's campus over the summer for a week, and let's do more of this and try to use more C-SPAN data and talk a whole week on multimodal classification. That sounds like a really fun time to me. So please look into that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I don't think there seems to be no additional questions, so I think we will conclude this talk and then move on to our next speaker. So thank you again, Joyce.
Thank you.
Round of applause. Thank you so much. And yes, we will move on to our next talk here. This presenter is a bit odd. So she is not a stranger to me, but she may be a stranger to you. Christina Walker is a fantastic PhD candidate here at Purdue University. She's also a member of my computational social science lab. We've been talking about this book chapter on and off for a little while now. So I'm very excited to see what Christina has cooked up for us today. And so without further ado, Christina, please take us away.
Thanks. Let me just share my screen really quick. All right. So with a lot of my work, I am trying to understand why politicians share misinformation. And in this chapter, Framing False Information, Examining Legislators' Discourse during January 6th, I'm focusing on those January 6th congressional committee hearings. So political misinformation is a problem. We know that it can shape public opinion, and about 3/4 of US adults think that it's led to political extremism. And we know that politicians are a major source of misinformation, but much of the research focuses on voters and why supporters and voters share misinformation rather than politicians or political elites. But we've obviously seen that politicians share it, which is the whole point of this committee and of other congressional hearings that have gone on. And the real issue there is drawing from elite cue theory that politicians shape public opinion via their discourse and what they say and what they cue the public to think about. And congressional hearings or committee hearings can serve as platforms for those cues and can impact the public's views on the legitimacy of misinformation and how the public thinks about misinformation discourse, how they talk about it, and how politicians portray misinformation can either clarify or confuse what people see as real in the political sphere and in the political information that they're getting. So with that, I'm asking, how do politicians talk about misinformation to try to get at understanding why politicians share it, and if they are this major source, if we can better understand why they're sharing it, we can create better mitigation strategies. So to do this, I transcribed the January 6th committee hearings, which took place at the end of 2022, following the year-long investigation of the 2021 attack on the US Capitol. The committee's mission was to take a comprehensive accounting of the insurrection attempt and educate the public about what happened and highlighting the role that politicians' discourse in those congressional hearings can play on public opinion. So again, drawing from that Q theory, the committee's goal was to educate the public and help them understand why this was such a big problem and that the big lie was in fact a lie. So transcribing the hearings, each of my observations ends up being each speaker. So when each speech that a speaker gave. So when Liz Cheney talked, gave a formal floor speech, that would be one observation, and then they would show video testimony of William Barr, and that testimony from William Barr would be another observation. And this went on for the 10 hearings that occurred. So I then labeled each observation as being either this formal floor speech that someone would give, evidence, so oftentimes they had video evidence from inside the Capitol. A lot of people probably saw the video with Nancy Pelosi and others like their lockdown during it, or as testimony, video testimony from Ivanka Trump, William Barr, and others. So to analyze what was going on and how politicians are talking about misinformation in this committee, I used natural language processing and drew on text analysis of those transcripts. So first, I found the most frequent words to understand what the common language used in the hearings was. And then ran a topic model to get the topics that were most brought up or discussed in those hearings. And then I ran a sentiment analysis, which gets the tone of those observations. So whether it's positive, a positive tone, negative, or neutral. And then I run those same analyses on subgroups. So both subgroups by topics and also subgroups by whether it was a formal speech, testimony, or evidence. As we would suspect, there would be differences in those. So overall, the most common words were president, Trump, election, Capitol, and people. So this gives an overall view that the focus of these hearings was on attributing blame to President Trump and the consequences of that day on not just the people who were present at the Capitol, but the broader US population and US democracy at large. As for the topic model, which this is for those who don't usually work with computational methods, this is just where it pulls the words that come up the most often together, and then you situate it into a topic. So here I have 3 main topics that this model came up with. So the first is actions of President Trump and the White House. So this included keywords like Capitol, people, Trump, White House, office, and this topic label is the one that I came up with, but those are the words that are most common that led me to come up with it, and also doing some qualitative analysis of the transcripts that fell under this topic. The second topic is about President Trump's claims of election fraud. So these included words like Trump, department, election, general. So really just focusing on the misinformation that Trump and others in his inner circle were spreading on social media during this time and the consequences of that. And then third, finally, is the impact on specific people. So with words like election, the vice president who had a major role in this January 6th committee, people in the US, how did January 6th and the big lie and this rhetoric surrounding the inner circle of Trump impact people across the US? So the sentiment analysis shows that while the majority of the tone of the committee was neutral, there was more positive sentiment than negative sentiment used, which is surprising when you're first looking at it and doesn't necessarily make sense, but breaking it down by these different subgroups makes these results a little bit clearer. So breaking it down by those topics, in that first topic of the actions of President Trump in the White House, there is a more negative sentiment. So the more negative the sentiment is, the closer it'll be to -1, and the more positive the sentiment is, the closer it'll be to +1. So the negative, sorry, now I'm switching. The negative sentiment here indicates that these speeches or these observations contain more criticism or disapproval, negative assessments, and which makes sense because they're attributing blame to a person, to the president, and that aligns with what we saw in those most frequent words analysis and the overall mission or goal of the committee. For the election fraud topic, this is a more average or neutral sentiment as it's closer to 0. So this is in part due because of the legal tone that these committees take on. So while there could be positive sentiment indicated when they're thanking the chair during their speeches, or a more neutral tone when they're taking on this more legal, nonpartisan, like a strictly legal, matter-of-fact tone, that then is balanced out by trying to underscore the threat that this posed and having that be more negative overall. So that leads to this more neutral sentiment. And finally, for the impact on specific people, this is where the positive sentiment really comes in. And looking at these observations, these transcripts that fell under this positive sentiment here, that really came from people on the committee expressing empathy towards those affected by the events of January 6th. So there was the mother and daughter in Georgia who faced death threats after January 6th, and there was a lot of support and empathy given to them by the committee, which led to these more positive sentiments, not necessarily for the situation at hand, but just in trying to express how horrible this was and trying to make them feel better and feel better about having to come back and testify on this issue. So then looking at the sentiment by the type of observation. So first there's testimony, which the top words in this topic, again, election, capital, it focuses more on attributing blame to others and who was really at fault. So it's primarily neutral here, and there's a little bit of a positive tone. Again, this largely draws from people trying to empathize with those testifying, thanking them for their time testifying and the details they provided. And then the more neutral tone comes from lawyers who were involved, trying to state their testimony as matter-of-factly as possible. And then for the more formal floor speeches, the opening, closing speeches, this is where you again see that more neutral tone, but it's largely negative. So while there's some positive tone here from those thank yous and other niceties, formalities, there is a more negative tone, as this is where they were preparing these speeches beforehand, focusing on how to best communicate to the general public how much of an issue this really was and how much involvement Trump and others really had in this. So it makes sense that this would be more negative as they're specifically talking about Trump and others who caused it, rather than necessarily talking to those providing testimony or who were most impacted by this but didn't cause it. And then finally, in the evidence, there's a much more positive tone, which again makes sense because this is where people were really justifying the actions they were taking. So Trump encouraging his supporters to go, saying how great it was that they were going, others around him saying how he was right and calling others and preemptively justifying their actions in case something like this happens, and to try to diminish that cognitive dissonance of potentially doing something harmful to democracy or doing something wrong. So overall, there is that more neutral tone with this more legal tone of the committees and trying to convey these messages as clearly as possible to the general public and trying to leave a lot of partisanship out of it, as well as to not isolate one party or the other and not make it seem like this Democratic circus is something that Democrats were trying to make up to increase their chances in the next elections. And with that, there is this primary focus on the attribution of blame, which is important because when we're thinking about how politicians talk about misinformation, it is a very different story when they're attributing blame to fellow politicians, and especially here to the president, rather than to voters or foreign actors or others, and trying to say that's not within the US and within its democratic systems that this is stemming from, but rather outside of it. So that is an important issue here, and this was a large turn in these more formal conversations about political misinformation. And then there's a secondary focus on impact, which again is sort of interesting that they would focus first on blame and who's to blame, and then second on the impact of what that really causes. Oftentimes we see scholars and newspapers and others talk more about the impact or the potential impact that these things could have, rather than necessarily who's to blame, just because often that's tricky. We see this with deepfakes now of like, who do we really blame? The consumer or the companies that created this, the people who are creating the deepfakes themselves. And instead, we talk more about what damage it could potentially cause. But for that impact on people, that sentiment is positive. Like I said, they're trying to console people, thank them for being there, make them feel better about the situation that they've been put in because of this political misinformation. And similarly, by subgroup, the evidence is much more positive as they tend to justify their actions that they're taking. So overall, the implications of this provide a closer individual analysis of how politicians frame and discuss misinformation, which can be important to better understand how to mitigate these problems, but also understanding their motivations and reasoning behind intentional sharing. In the future, I would want to conduct more video or audio analysis, particularly video, to also capture those facial expressions and body language that can also help us understand how politicians are really thinking about misinformation, since they're not just going to tell you that they're sharing it or their motivations for sharing it. If you ask them, that's sort of the best way to get at it otherwise. And also, it would be interesting to compare this to other hearings and political events, especially to better understand the partisan differences. Obviously, this committee was primarily Democrats. It was largely focusing on Trump, as it was this one event. So looking at other times that they've talked about misinformation would be really useful to better understand how they talk about this and how they talk about it when it's in a less formal setting than a committee hearing. And then finally, similarly, looking at how discourse about misinformation changes over time and context. So has how politicians talk about misinformation changed from 2000 to now with the rise of social media. That too could give us some insight into how this problem really evolved and how it's changed in the minds of politicians and as a strategy for them. And I'll stop there. Maybe we'll get a couple minutes back, but thanks.
Thank you so much for the lovely presentation. Are there any questions? Go ahead, Robert.
I was struck at first till the last slide about party. So you think that party was a constant for the Democratic Party?
So within these committees, so I did code, like, I mean, especially for the evidence, right? Like the evidence was largely from Republicans. Obviously, there weren't solely Democrats on this committee, but largely it was Democrats. It's just tricky still to, I mean, while I can run that analysis on Republicans versus Democrats, it's still tricky just because even the evidence is edited, right? Like it's edited to make the points that they're trying to make in their speeches. So it's a little bit less clear if that really shows how Republicans overall and the Republicans sharing the misinformation, if that's really how they talk about it when it's, you know, these snippets pulled from a bunch of different videos. Yeah.
Okay, and how about the representation? I'm trying to think back to the hearings. There weren't any people defending the groups, right? They would be represented in the video if at all.
For the groups,
Proud Boys
yeah.
or anything of that sort. So it was police officers and sort of, so I just wonder what impact that had.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, yeah, they were in the evidence. There was some testimony from members of the Proud Boys, members of like Trump's inner circle too. And yeah, like it is interesting because especially when they had that testimony, and this was largely like the external video testimony from those members, it was interesting to see the individuals who were like part of the Proud Boys who changed. You know, they would show the video of them talking about it on January 6th and how their rhetoric changed to the testimony when actually being asked about it, especially given that at the same time, many of them were going through like true legal battles about this. So, yeah, no, it definitely is interesting to see that difference. And again, I think it would just require looking at different contexts and more of these hearings, you know, and maybe like those legal trials as well to see more of how they talk about it and who they themselves attribute blame to.
Okay, and one more little simple question. What software did you use for your either word counts or your sentiment analysis?
Yeah, so I ran it all through Python. So with the word frequency, it's really just a bag of words approach. Yeah.
How about the sentiment analysis? Is that out of Python?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I can give you code later if you want.
Just curious about that. So
yes, Matthew, go ahead.
Yes, hi. So like Robert, I was trying to think back about the committee hearings, and a few pieces of information are kind of flooding my head. And I'm not making sense of what my impressions ought to be with that committee hearing process and findings. And I wanted to get your insights about this. So with the neutrality angle that you presented, I started to kind of rethink my perspective of that committee hearing. And one of the things that maybe came to my mind was the idea of Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney getting together with maybe Democratic leadership and wanting to have a more, I don't know, nonpartisan, non-grandstanding tone, right? More of a, let's make this as serious as we can be. Let's make this more of a prosecution style committee hearing. I wanted to know if you had any impressions about kind of like a more neutral undertone that the leadership wanted to do with this committee style, even though they had some at night. And when they did the evening sessions, I thought they were going to go the grandstanding route with it, because they're going for prime time slots. But your kind of research is suggesting otherwise. My kind of impressions are leaning your way too. I just didn't know if you were coming across articles and other kind of quotes from leadership, Nancy Pelosi or others, who were kind of echoing what you were proving with your research.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the biggest evidence that I kind of saw was in, leading up to each hearing, there was so much talk in the news and online about what they were going to show that day, what would come out, and even the release of the report. Like, people were expecting it to be more salacious and to really be talked about. But then when the hearings happened, you really didn't hear much about what really happened in them. I mean, I feel like the thing that went the most viral, so to speak, is, that video of Pelosi and others, like calling different governors, trying to get the National Guard there. Like, that was the thing that people talked about the longest. And I think this neutral tone that, like you said, I mean, they really emphasized that to try to get away from people saying, it was for grandstanding or for the Democratic Party to get ahead. And in doing so, I think it kind of isolated a lot of people who were interested, because there was such a neutral tone, because there was such formality and such a legal tone. And while they were trying to make it, get away from that rhetoric, but also really make it seem like there was this true legal aspect here, it did have the effect of, it didn't really stay in the news cycle that long. And when the report was released, like, people just kind of were like, oh yeah, the report was released, and you didn't hear that much about it. So I think that's where you really see that. Whereas when there were these one-offs, or, on the steps after, when people would say things that were a little more partisan and a little more salacious, like, that was more what people were talking about in the general public and in these news spheres. So hopefully I answered your question.
Excellent. So we will end it at that. I have some questions as well, but I will share those with Christina the next time I see her.
8:30
thank you so
a.m.
much.
tomorrow.
Exactly, right. I will send to you 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. Everybody else, thank you so much for the great presentation.